Thank you very much. A very good evening to all of you, and especially to Merelin, who's been sort of coordinating and making this easy. Most of you do not know that just a few moments earlier, we are having technical glitches, but well, the organizers have solved it very, very admirably. Right. Now, I'm supposed to speak on 2 days. Tomorrow, I'll be speaking on something which I'm working on recently, and that is Rabindranath Tagore and ecology with Indian knowledge systems. Today, however, I'll be going back a little bit in time, going back to one of the most timeless texts of Indian literature, as it were, Indian classical Sanskrit Indian literature, and that is the Panchatantra, a text which, well, thank you, Merelin, for sharing this. One of the fundamental texts of Indian Katha, as it were, the Panchatantra. Now, the Panchatantra for many of us is familiar because we have read it essentially as a children's text, as an animal fable, along with Aesop's fables and others. But as a repository of wisdom, Panchatantra was essentially a text meant for adults. And it was essentially meant in terms of, disseminating knowledge systems within the Indian rubric of the 4 Purusharthas. We'll be discussing this. We'll be talking about Panchatantra as a way of Indian pedagogy, moving in learning through narrative. And we'll also be taking a look at the various issues that the Panchatantra raises through its corpus of stories. Now, we will be talking about Panchatantra within the secular Sanskritic tradition of Niti Shastra. What did Niti mean? And how was Panchatantra, grafted within this science of Niti? These are issues that we'll be looking at. We'll also be looking at the ways in which Panchatantra looks at certain notions of power, which makes it valid even today. We'll be looking at issues of justice also, since it's been organized by a law university. So I thought, it would be apt to look at issues of law that the Panchatantra brings in. And we'll be also looking at issues regarding gender, patriarchy, and trade and commerce that the Panchatantra highlights. So all in all, what I see in Panchatantra is a compendium of knowledge systems, really, of the Niti Shastra, which is spread across a breadth of living sciences. Right. So that is why I've titled this The Science of Niti. If we can please move to the next slide, please. Now, Panchatantra, of course, is divided into 2 words. Pancho, which means 5, and that is 5. And the tantras are principles, right? Now, in this sense, I'll be using, of course, for the purpose of the pan-India audience, and it's apt, really, because Panchatantra is spread across India. I'll be using this version. It's, Arthur William Ryder's English version of the Panchatantra. The 5 books of the 5 tantras of the Panchatantra are Mitra Bheda, the loss of friends, on causing dissension among allies. The major characters here are the lion, bull, and jackals. The Mitra Labha, or the gaining of friends, winning of friends, on securing allies. So you can see that each of these translations are also talking about ways in which human power relationships occur in terms of a state and also at a personal level. Now, this is to be fathomed. You see, the Panchatantra operates at two levels, knowledge systems at two levels. At the first level, it is about how a state operates, how power operates within a state. And therefore, at the fulcrum or at the center of that entire discourse lies the king, the ruler. It also operates at a domestic level where the family is at the center, the neighbors are there, and therefore at the center of this is the contemporary man, as it were. I use the word man very deliberately because, the Panchatantra is a very patriarchal text in many senses of the term. Now, that is why you see Mitra Labha becomes winning of friends at a personal level and on securing allies at another level. Here, the major characters are the mouse, deer, and friends. Now, how much of a beast fable it is and how much of an anthropomorphic text it is, we shall take a quick look at it later on. The third and most interesting book, which I shall probably discuss in some detail, is Kak Ulukyam. Kak, as you know, is crow. Uluk is an owl. So Kak Ulukyam is on crows and owls. It is a treatise really on war and peace and talks about the story of the crows and the owls. Then there is the Labha Prasarnam, which is the laws of Labdha Prasarnam, the loss of gains. And here the important characters are the monkey and the crocodile. And the final and the more, a rather redundant part of the text is Aparishat Karamanam, which is ill-considered action or unhasty actions. Right? So these are the 5 tantras which give us a composite idea about Indian society, about kingship, power, about women, love, desire, trade, and therefore create, as I said, a compendium of knowledge systems where everyday life, on the basis of which everyday life is to be tested. If I can move on to the next slide, please. Right. Just to give you an idea of the third book of the Panchatantra, which I'll be discussing in slightly greater detail, Kak Ulukyam has a total of 18 tales. Now, one of the things that we must notice about the Panchatantra is the structure of the Panchatantra and the complexity of the organization of the tales. Now, there is a series, think in terms of a series of concentric circles. On the outer circle lies the story of Amara Shakti, who has his worthless, a very reputed king who has his worthless sons who refuse to be educated. And many saints and learned people have failed. And there is this sage called Vishnu Sharma who comes up and says that I'm going to, educate your children and I will educate them in 6 months. And within 6 months, through the Panchatantra or through the method of the story, the practical storytelling, he educates the princes so that they become eminently learned and capable of ruling the state. So you have, this is the outer structure. The inner structure within these 5, within this broader structure, lies 5 different circles, right? So 5 different tantras. And each of these tantras have separate tales. And each of these tales, one tale leads to the other. So there are inboxed rather tales, much like, a Russian doll that, you take out one doll and another comes out from within it. You take out that doll and another comes out from within it. So the complexity of the Katha tradition within the Indian, literary discourse is best expressed in the Panchatantra. So Kakulukiam, the third book, will have a total of 18 tales, right? Where the broader narrative is the battle between the crows and the owls. Now, just to give you an idea, the owls have an enmity with the crows. The crows have to decide what to do. And here, what the Panchatantra will do is initiate a polemic. Now, many of you will also have the idea that very often it is said that Vishnu Sharma, who is the supposed author of the Panchatantra, is also Chanakya. There's an argument that Chanakya and Vishnu Sharma were actually the one and the same. And therefore we have, texts like the Arthashastra, right? Which is a manual, which is in that sense, something which is codified. It's a coda, as it were. You do this, you must do this, you must do that. What the Panchatantra does, however, is also produce multiple perspectives of knowledge. What do I mean by this? It creates a polemic about what to do in a situation of adversity. So what do the crows do? Because they are less powerful, right? So the crow king, Cloudy, calls a conference where several of his ministers give dissenting opinions. For example, Live Again says, if there is a stronger foe, make peace. Live Well says, we must fight till the death. Live Along says, let us change base. Live On says, do not change base. Live Long says, make an ally of the powerful. And finally, Live Strong says, whose opinion, Cloudy accepts, he says, apply duplicity, apply spice, and therefore create a diversion, and through cunning and deceit, destroy the owl's nest. Similarly, the owl king, who is named Foe Crusher, has different advisors again. Red Eye, for example, says, kill the crows, never let an enemy prosper. Fierce Eye says, mercy, show mercy to the weak. Flame Eye says, a benefactor might prove useful, so keep him as an ally. Hook Nose says, he's a supplicant, the crows are supplicants, so we can gain an advantage from him. And Warrior says, build friendship. It's interesting because, think about it in terms of not only a problem between crows and owls, think about it in terms of a geostrategic relationship between different states as well. What does one do in this case? For example, if you go by mercy, there is the law of shelter. There's the law where you actually give asylum. Does one give asylum to somebody who is an enemy if he sues for peace? It's an important question that geostrategists will be asking. So the Panchatantra sort of lays out these contours of knowledge through the animal fable. And therefore, all these opinions generate their own set of stories. Why am I saying this? I am pointing out to the fact that the Panchatantra is arguing that knowledge systems in India are not one, that there are multiple opinions, multiple debates, and that the Niti at that point of time can also change with context, right? So it is not, in that sense, a dharma shastra, in the sense that it is purely ethical religion. It is a secular Niti Shastra. When Niti is defined in certain ways, and I'll be coming to that in a certain moment. Right. So you have, as it were, this very complex organization of life of narrative to mirror the many possibilities that arise in real life situations. So Panchatantra in that sense is also a maze of knowledge. Right, if we can please move to the next slide. Now, before I go into this entire science of Niti, let us talk for a very brief moment about Vishnu Sharma. Now, the name occurs in the preamble to the text and nowhere else. So, Vishnu Sharma does not actually narrate anything. He's known to be a celebrated teacher living in Mahillaropia, a place which is, which could be any place in Tamil Nadu, probably Mysore, right? So, Vishnu Sharma might have been the name of the storyteller who had the imagination and the artistry to first shape a floating body of folklores into the complex and unique structure and well-defined purpose that the Panchatantra is. So, one does not really know who Vishnu Sharma is, whether Vishnu Sharma actually existed. So, many of these texts, Panchatantra including, is therefore a compendium of oral knowledge collected at one point of time and given an authorship which is tenuous at best, right? So the Panchatantra therefore derives from what we will call different folk narratives, different kinds of narratives from different regions, right? So none of the names of all the storytellers are subsumed under his name. So you have this practice, for example, the Mahabharata, the Natya Shastra, where, we can't say that there's just one author, that it brings together many authors, many stories, many sources. And we can also have this idea that Vishnu Sharma actually is a fictional name altogether, right? That there is nobody actually named Vishnu Sharma, is just a character in the text. Now, the names Vishnu Gupta and Vishnu Sharma were often associated with Chanakya. So in that sense, there has been the suggestion that Chanakya was himself the author of the Panchatantra, but this is again quite debatable, and there is no evidence to this context. Right. Okay, if we can now move on. Now, let us talk for a brief moment about the places and locations of the Panchatantra. Its text begins in a place other than Kashmir, and Mahillaropia is in the southern lands. We have references to Patliputra, Vardhaman, which is in West Bengal, Kosala, which is in Uttar Pradesh. So it is, in that sense, a very pan-Indian text with tales originating from many sources, right? So the place names might have been carried over with specific tales that originated in these locations. Or these stories are, as in the animal fable, very vaguely located in a certain woodland, by the edge of a certain pool, in a lotus pool. But overall, through the place names, we have the sense of a greater Indian subcontinent. Salman Rushdie had this text called Haroun and the Sea of Stories. So the Panchatantra is actually bringing together the sea of stories of the Indian subcontinent. The next one, please. Right. Now, therefore, the question of dating becomes very, very important in the Panchatantra. We don't know what the date of the Panchatantra is. So the only date that we have is the first recension right? And this is Punarbhadra Suri. In 1199 AD, we have a technical dating of the Panchatantra, stating his own name, the name of his patron, and the date according to the Indian calendar in the colophon of his text. That is where we have dated Panchatantra. So it is probably one of the earliest, texts which articulate the Indian approach to secular life, as it were. If you could move on now. Do the next slide, please. Can we move on to the next slide, please?
1 second, so it's not moving. 1 second. 1 second.
Right.
This one? This one?
Yeah, this one. Right. Thank you. Now, the Panchatantra incidental. No, we've gone back. The next one, please. Right. The next one, the next slide actually talks about the two components of literature. Why do we read literature? The Panchatantra is asking us this question in one of its verses. Oh, I should also mention this. I have not, that the stories themselves are in prose, whilst the knowledge that it imparts is in verse. Why is this taking place? Primarily because probably the fact remains that the learning that the Panchatantra wants to impart is placed in verse so that it reaches and penetrates the audience to a greater depth. So we have these two categories, as classical learning and Indian learning suggests, that stories are meant for two purposes. One is utility, and the other is dulce, or a delight. Now, in that sense, the Panchatantra, of course, articulates this position of a pedagogy of learning through fable, right, as opposed to more what we will call a more direct way of learning. Now, interestingly, the Panchatantra happens also to be one of the most translated and circulated of all Indian texts. We'll see in a matter of minutes where it all sort of moved. So in terms of entertainment, that is where you see the Panchatantra becomes such an important book for children. It has art and artistry with which the tales are interwoven in the discourse, skillful blend of narrative and dialogue with maxim and precept, and an overarching frame in which the tales are set. Now, as the Panchatantra moves across continents, it first travels to Persia, and from Persia it travels also to the West. So, as it moves, the Panchatantra has gradually become a text which is more of moralistic philosophy. We have reduced Panchatantra to a simpler level of individual stories. But the Panchatantra must be read not as individual stories of, say, for example, the jackal who was colored blue, which we tell our children, but it must be appreciated in its totality. That's the point which I was trying to make. The next one, please. Okay. As Merelin moves forward, I'll move forward a little bit. So where do we locate the Panchatantra then? I mean, say, why am I saying that it is probably the most well-known text of Indian literature? We locate the tales of the Panchatantra in the Arabian Nights. We locate it in the Gesta Romanorum. We have shades of these tales in Boccaccio's Decameron. We have shades of it in the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. And we have also some of these tales repeated in Grimm's fairy tales, right? But the two most important places where we see the influences of the Panchatantra are in the Arabian Nights and La Fontaine's, fables in France. So what I'm trying to sort of look at is, yeah, the next one is. Right. So what I'm trying to look at is again the range of the Panchatantra and how tales, as it were, stories, have this habit of moving across seas and oceans. Okay, let's come to the core issue now. The question of Niti, with which we started. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Right. So Niti, is a word which we can really not translate, just like dharma in religion. Dharma is not to be just simply translated as religion, right? It has a range of closely linked meanings, signifies an attitude and conduct that represents a way of life, includes carrying out duties and obligations, familial and socio-political, and the exercise of practical wisdom in affairs private and public. So the king's Niti is not necessarily the priest's Niti, right? We have separate Nitis for everybody, but the major overarching purpose of Niti is happiness in life, happiness and fulfillment in life. So we do not have the wisdom of a sage or a saint. As I said, it is a secular knowledge, but wisdom that has to govern the thinking and conducting of worldly people in their daily duties and activities. In that sense, you see, the Panchatantra is very different from the religious wing of the Indian knowledge systems. It entails resolute action taken after careful scrutiny and due deliberation. And, the boundaries, therefore, between good and evil, in a strictly ethical sense, do not apply to the Panchatantra at all, especially when it comes to administrators, princes, rulers. So the sanctioning of violence, for example, is something of a Niti of the king, but it cannot be a Niti of the priest. So different Nitis for different people. Next one, please. Next slide, please, if you could go on. Yeah. Now, many have said that the Panchatantra is actually about power. It is about kings. And therefore, it is in many ways like Chanakya's Arthashastra or Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It is a monarch's manual, right? So, Punarbhadra Suri, for example, talks about it as a Nripati Shastra, right? It suggests that, it is about Rajniti, Raj Dharma. Raj Dharma was a very debated topic some years ago, and it is still now. But it is about how the king should behave, right? But the Panchatantra, many of the tales of the Panchatantra are not about the state at all. It is about ordinary people. It is about the husband and the wife. It is about domesticity, right? So there is a continuous blend between the private and the public world. And that is where, in that liminal area of Indian knowledge systems, that the Panchatantra is more than a monarch's manual. Okay, next one, please. So what does it really talk about? It talks about three concepts. It begins with the concept of buddhi, or intellect, and intelligence, the use of intelligence and common sense. Then it comes to avabodhanartham, the awakening of the intellect. So pedagogy, or the study of the Panchatantra, awakens the intellect. And the third, or the most complex phase, is the Buddhi Prabodhanam, which is awakening the intellect in resolute action. So it has a tripartite structure where the Panchatantra, if you want to use its Western counterpart, is creating an Indian model of the mind. It is about awakening the mind rather than the body. It prioritizes the mind over the body, right? So it is not exactly, in that sense, not providing formal instruction in polity and allied branches using traditional rote methods, but it is through stories and through practical application, a mode of awakening the intellect. So real life as a source of, practical life as a source of wisdom. Okay, if you can move on to the next one. So what are the themes that the Panchatantra talks about? And this is its first major notion, the theme of the ideal king, right? So the ideal king is a warrior, scholar, and accomplished in the arts. Therefore, the king is, in that sense, what Rabindranath will be talking about the Panchatantra in that sense is a Rajarshi, who is a Raja in terms of power and a Rishi in terms of governance, in the sense that he will always put the Praja forward rather than himself. He will self-abnegate in that sense for the cause of the Praja, right? So, ideal, well-rounded individual. Right? Now, the Panchatantra, especially Kakulukya, argues that the first responsibility of the king is to maintain peace and fulfill conditions of prosperity. If you could move on to the next one, please. Right. The fulfillment, what is the role of the state and the king? The Panchatantra asks. It is to fulfill the three Purusharthas. Remember, we have the four Purusharthas. One of the Purusharthas is not the purpose of the Panchatantra, and that is moksha. The Panchatantra puts forward dharma, artha, and kama, right? So, in that sense, it does not set up impracticable ideas for men and women in a social and political context. So, one has to live wisely and well in the truest sense of the two terms. Secondly, it uses these three Purusharthas, dharma, artha, and kama, on which society is grounded and which forms the framework for all human actions and relationships. So this threefold structure is the philosophical structure of the Panchatantra. If you could move on to the next one, let me go through these one by one. Now here, dharma is again law, righteousness, duty, moral and social order, and the inherent property or quality of a thing. I will talk about this a little later also when I come to the dharma of the trader that the Panchatantra will be talking about. But as I said, the first dharma of the king is to protect his kingdom, and therefore he can take recourse to any ethical or non-ethical means to achieve this protection of his kingdom, right? So in that sense, Raj Dharma and ethical dharma, in that sense, religion, are two different concepts. Artha, economy, material resources, and their management. The Panchatantra is an extremely materialistic text. So the material knowledge of India is contained, as it were, in the Panchatantra. And of course, there is this question of desire. Panchatantra talks about sexuality. it talks about women, it talks about lust, and the harnessing of this, this desire within the familial structure. What is the role of the dharma of the wife? What is the dharma of the husband? What is the punishment and what is the justice if these dharmas are violated? Right? So the ethical, social, the material, economic, and the emotional dimensions. You see, why I say that the Panchatantra is the compendium, as it were, of Indian knowledge systems. No other text, I would say, apart from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, encompass such a wide range of knowledge systems. Now, moksha, or a freedom from worldly concerns and pursuits, is not part of the Panchatantra. In fact, there is only one tale of the self-sacrificing dove. This story is about the female dove being captured by a hunter who is very hungry. And the male dove says to the hunter, you are my guest, so I must extend hospitality to you. And for that, to create warmth, I will burn myself in the fire. The female dove then says, when my husband has died, I will sacrifice myself. And the hunter says, if they are so pure, then I will also sacrifice and renounce this sinful life. But remember, please, that this is the one-off in Panchatantra. Panchatantra does not do away with life. The Panchatantra engages with everyday existence in a very significant way. Right? So the three Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha, and Kama. Right. If we move on to the next one, please. Dharma, again, both absolute and relative. So it is in the observance of the individual's place in the scheme of things and duties pertaining to that place. In the sense of the law, prescribes duties, responsibilities, and rights appropriate to an individual in a social life. In a certain way, the Panchatantra also lays down codes of caste. And therefore, we cannot say that the Panchatantra is free from its casteist aspersions. I'll also suggest that the Panchatantra follows, in that sense, in many ways, the Manusmriti. Right? But broadly, it is the dharma of the king and the warrior to fight and shed blood. And this is exemplified, and that is why I was talking about the Kakulukyam, where it is the duty of the Crow king to protect his people. And it is the duty of the Crow minister who accepts the hospitality of the owls and sets fire to their residence. Normally, if you look at dharma in the Indian context, you know, we have this saying called Atithi Devo Bhaya, right? Devo Bhava, right? But the Atithi also has certain, you know, duties towards the host. In this particular case, the Crow minister who is accepted by the owls violates that code of hospitality. So is he committing adharma? The Panchatantra asks. And answers no. The dharma of the minister is towards the king and the state. Therefore, in that state, you know, even if you violate hospitality, you are actually sort of protecting your own dharma. That is why I'm saying that the code of dharma that the Panchatantra argues is relative to a certain extent. Right. The next one, please. Arth. This is a very important part of the Panchatantra. In fact, most of the tales of the Panchatantra are about money and greed. Right? So the Panchatantra has a clear argument. It says, unlike moksha or unlike, you know, vanaprastha, life is to be enjoyed and money is a source of enjoyment. Therefore, one must have the ability to acquire money. Poverty is not something that the Indian economic system glorified in any sense of the term. So plenitude is something that the Panchatantra talks about. Right? To live in this world, it argues money is needed. To do without wealth, the person has to follow the path of the great sages and to retreat into the forest or lonely mountain caves. But it again forbids greed. So adequate money for comfort, but not too much to harm people. That is what the argument about money is. Right? A greater part of the Panchatantra is a critique of greed in the fifth tantra. But if you look at this text in its totality, the Panchatantra is about power and the acquisition of money. So both power and money are seen as systems and preferences that are to be acquired. I think here we have a very radical text which is arguing about ways and means in which you can actually fool people. For example, the three rogues who steal the Brahmin's goat by arguing that he's carrying a dead ass. Somebody says you're carrying a dead cow. It is a valid way. So fooling a foolish person is a valid way of acquiring wealth, right? So buddhi, the world of the Panchatantra is quite a cutthroat world where you exist, in competition with others, where money is a valid goal, and for that, intellect and cunning can be used at up to certain levels, right? If we move on to the next one, please. Now, interestingly, one of the major areas of the Panchatantra is a validation of trade, right? Now, this is again from the fifth tantra. It argues that a king's favor is a thing unstable. Crows peck at winnings charitable. You make it in learning the professions. Too many wearisome concessions to teachers. Farms are too much labor. In usury, you lend your neighbor the cash which is your life, and therefore you really live a poor man. Wherefore, it argues, I see in trade the only living that can be truly pleasure-giving. Hurrah for trade. Now, it then lays out certain manuals about trade also. So what are the ways of trade? It says that profitable trade, this I'm reading out, I couldn't put it in that slide. It says, how can you be wealthy through trade? It can be through false weights and measures, price boosting, keeping a pawn shop, getting regular customers, a stock company, articles which are of deluxe nature like perfumes, and finally foreign trade. And the Panchatantra makes a very strong pitch for foreign trade. It argues that this is the best way to attain riches and artha. And therefore, we've been given this idea about Brahman as being something which was against the Hindu tradition. But we see that for traders, the concept of Brahman and foreign trade was something which was permissible, right? So it is in this way that stories also travel. It is in this way that trade and commerce also come to India, right? And therefore, the Panchatantra is a text that therefore also puts forward through certain very basic narratives the idea of trade as being the predominant and most fulfilling vocation in life, right? So much so that trade is validated even above learning. You see, the mendicant scholar is not the ideal of the Panchatantra. There are two ideals of the Panchatantra. One is the powerful king, and two is the complete and prosperous trader. Right. The next one, please. Now, a corpus of the text, approximately 1/4 of the texts also deal with desire and the family. So it highlights moderation and restraint. Therefore, lust is something that the Panchatantra wants again. Greed and lust, in that sense, that excessive desire is to be shunned because it always leads to ruin. But very crucially, you see, almost always the excessive desire is located in the woman, right? I'll come to this point a little later. And therefore, the Panchatantra is not a very woman-friendly text in that sense of the term, right? And we can quite understand the structure of the Indian family. But at the same time, what the Panchatantra validates again is the role of the wife as the center of the family, in the sense that without the wife, the house, as it were, the Panchatantra argues, the man is not complete, and that the unit of society cannot survive. So in a sense, it prioritizes the wife, but at the same time, it is very anxious about female desire. And therefore, you know, the courtesan or the wife is often portrayed in terms of being adulterous, and therefore must be continually punished or mutilated. One of these areas of the Panchatantra, which we can critique, therefore, is its gender insensitivity. And I think that part of it is also related in the way in which the woman is framed in our knowledge systems, as it were. But the family again, family, friendship, these are issues which are primary in the enjoyment of a good life. Next one, please. Now, you have already seen that the first two books of the Panchatantra are titled Mitra Bheda and Mitra Labha, right? So friendship becomes camaraderie, companionship, sociability. All these are very crucial aspects that the Panchatantra is talking about. So, you know, the Panchatantra is not about the atomistic realization of knowledge, in the sense that, you know, reading the Upanishad is the enlightenment of the soul, but it is the individual soul. In this particular case, the nature of knowledge of the Panchatantra is communal, in the sense that it is based on the community. And therefore, friendship is an extremely vital theme in the Panchatantra. But there is an argument that true friendship is possible only between equals. And these friendships once made, alliances once made, again, the domestic and the political, alliances once made are iron cast, as it were, right? Now, if we look at the different provinces being, separated, and the alliances being made between the different kingdoms, what the Panchatantra is arguing about to the king is the importance of political alliances, the preservation of friends, and the bheda between friends. If you look at today's scenario in the geostrategic sense, again, there are friends whom you go back to, and there are friends whom you make out of exigency, and there are friends who betray you. Should you go back to that friend? These are questions that the Panchatantra is asking of us and inserting advice through its verses. Next one, please. Right. So the ultimate aim then is the balancing the demands of the individual in society so that the ethical, social, material, and emotional aspect of personality may be integrated and lead to a life that is lived wisely and in the truest sense. So the balance within the individual, right? The balance of dharma, artha, and kama. That is the science of Niti. So if you look at the Panchatantra, in many ways, those of us who are students of humanities, and the European humanities go back to the Renaissance, we talk about a studia humanitatis, that is the education or the fashioning of a self. The Panchatantra is attempting to fashion this self not through an esoteric pedagogical text, but through a more, innovative narrative, through a more innovative and narrative technique. It is applying common sense or the Niti in daily life, right? So it's gentle, it uses the parable and sets forth a civilized way of life. So the Panchatantra is all about distilling Indian knowledge systems and fashioning them into an ideal citizen self. That is the way in which narrative is distilling, ways of philosophy in both the individual as well as within the state. If you can move to the next one, please. Right. Now, there's this question about the human and the non-human. This is something which we discuss with our literary students. This is, of course, a beast fable. But please remember that, well, the Panchatantra is being written at a time when man and this beast were much closer, not like in our society where we can look at certain animals only when we go to a zoo. So it's a way of living in which the human and the animal are very closely entwined, right? But very importantly, the forest, as it were, mirrors the village or the urban habitation, in the sense that there are different mandalas in the forest, and you have a very distinct feudal hierarchy there with the king, with his ministers. In that sense, we can suggest that in reality, these are all masks. The animals are all masks. And like in beast fables, it is really an anthropomorphic concern that the Panchatantra is dealing with. However, what the beast fable does, as with any beast fable, is, it gives us an idea of, or a certain amount of delight and imagination, which is very important to provoke this as a text for children. See, part of, let me just dabble here for a minute. You have Christ's parables, for Christian parables of Christ. You have Sri Ramakrishna Paramhansa's the Kathamrita, which uses the parable again. The parable is a story which has a moral attached to it. But the parable is very human. And very often, it does not provoke the imagination. The Panchatantra, on the other hand, by using the animal, creates an imaginary range, and therefore is accessible not only to children, but to adults alike. Take an example which we all know, Gulliver's Travels, for example. We read it as children's literature, but Gulliver's Travels is a devastating satire on contemporary England and can be read at many levels. So Panchatantra can be read as a manual of, a way in which you can actually read Chanakya's Arthashastra through stories. It can be also read as a delightful tale of children, of what to avoid and what not to avoid. It is this range of the Panchatantra again, which makes it very accessible to all kinds of readers. Now, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana again are texts that are again adultish, in the sense that, the Mahabharata, of course, is a text which is a very adult text in that sense of the term. The Ramayana is simpler in certain ways, but it is again meant for adults. The Panchatantra is a text that seamlessly moves across different ages in which it can impart wisdom. Right, if we move on to the next one. Now, you will find, of course, that the beast fable has recurrently been used as a tool in Indian narrative tradition. You have the legend of Sharma in the Rig Veda. You have Nal and Damayanti in Mahabharata. The Chandogya Upanishad, for example, uses Shuttokam, right? And therefore, again, within the Indian knowledge system, again, the order of the animal, the Western knowledge system uses the state of the three souls: the vegetative soul, the animal soul, and the rational soul. In that sense, one of the major differences in which the Panchatantra operates is not making this kind of a distinction at all, in the sense that, all of it is seen as part of one existence, as it were. Next slide, please. Right. So again, these questions about gender and patriarchy. So representations of women in deeply patriarchal terms, again, source of a desire, always the lust is seen as excess. Apart from, wives are either faithful or, they are promiscuous. So women as antithetical to policy and intelligence. Women as very frequently adulterous. Violence against women very casually accepted. So, chopping off the nose, cutting off the ear, beating a wife is something that is very casually sanctioned in the Panchatantra. And in very few cases, there is the case for domesticity and bliss. You see, the entire story of the monkey and the crocodile is, that friendships between the monkey and the crocodile is lost because the crocodile's wife wants to eat the liver of the heart, of the monkey, right? Which is the friend of the crocodile. And the crocodile is, put into a dharma sankat, as it were. Does he keep his friend or does he keep his wife? Right. Anyways, the next one, please. So this is one major area of inequality that the Panchatantra articulates. Right. We've talked about the collection of the stories. So I'll skip over this slide, please. The next one, please. Again, not formal instruction. I'm sorry, the earlier one. Oh, no. Sorry. Next one. Right. So again, pedagogy. The Panchatantra is asking us again, what is the best method of pedagogy? See, at this point of time, we talk about play schools, we talk about creating storyboards, we talk about, learning through stories. The Panchatantra articulates this not merely at a level of the child, but also at the level of the adult, right? So straddling the adult and the child's level at the same time. That is where, knowledge systems can be surprisingly flexible in that certain way. Right. Next one, please. Now, this is interesting again, because I was looking at texts, especially for this institution, to think about what makes a good judge. how does the Panchatantra talk about justice? And one of the things it talks about is if the judge is a poor judge. For example, it talks about the cat judge who eats both the badi and the bibadi, as it were, both the applicants for justice, because it is inherently, it creates a system of justice that cannot deliver justice. But in general, what the Panchatantra argues is that the king's judges are rational. They have certain ways of judging people. And very interestingly, in the fifth story of the Panchatantra, it uses behavioral psychology to look at how one distinguishes between the criminal and the innocent. So guilty man is terrified, his pride is gone, sweat appears upon his brow, the culprit can shake and gaze upon the ground, the innocent is self-reliant. Of course, ironically, in the tale itself, the barber who has thrown his wife, his razor at the wife, and the wife who has committed adultery and has his nose cut off, seizes that occasion to penalize the barber for having sort of mutilated her. In this case, the barber is terrified, but he is not a guilty party. So again, the Panchatantra shows how very often codes of justice and behavioral justice are flawed. Again, please remember that justice was meted out in a more informal system within the court and within the panchayats, if you say that, within by the king's judges. So the flaws of justice and the codes in which justice operated are hinted at in the Panchatantra, but the Panchatantra argues that justice is something that has to be deliberated upon, and that the role of witnesses, the role of behavior becomes important, and that justice is often miscarried. Right. The next one, please. Now let me come, I've spoken for quite some significant amount of time. Let us see how the Panchatantra actually travels, And it's very interesting in the way that the Panchatantra moves from story to art. You see, these are engravings in Karnataka, for example, and see the range of, places in which very often the temple carvings carry the stories of the Panchatantra. So the Panchatantra is not only accepted as a mode of secular teaching, it is also very frequently accepted within the temples, as it were. So it enters into the coda of knowledge across the secular and the non-secular, right? Into the religious as well. If you notice a few other, stories as well. Next slide, please. The other pictures which I wanted to show. You can see the stories of the elephant, for example, and how the Panchatantra becomes enmeshed within temple architecture. Next, please. Again, Karnataka, you see the engravings on the temples. You have, next one, please. This is Java. So interesting is the way in which the stories of the Panchatantra travel along with Indian traders to different places. So the sea of stories, again, overseas traders who come to India, take back the Panchatantra to their respective lands. The next one, please. This is, again, the Panchatantra in Rajasthan. So again, a pan-Indian context in which the Panchatantra operates, why we call it part of the Indian knowledge system. Next one, please. This is an interesting one because this is the major and the first text, Persian text, which is about Khalil and Dimna. The original names were Karataka, right? So Karataka becomes Khalil, Kalila, and Damanaka, the two jackals, becomes Dimna. This travels to Persia and is enmeshed within the Arabic language. And you see, from Arabia, it travels to the West. Again, the Sea of Stories movie. Right. Next one, please. So this is again Persian, Anwar is Suhaili. But next comes a very interesting story about the Panchatantra. And this is what I will essentially end with. The next one, please. This is a story from the Shahnama, the Book of Kings, Persia's late 10th century national epic by Firdausi. So we are talking about a Persian national epic where the Panchatantra finds a place of honor. So Borzoi seeks his king's permission to make a trip to Hindustan to find a mountain herb, which when mingled into a compound and sprinkled over a corpse, is immediately restored to life. He does not find the herb, but is told that the Panchatantra is that herb instead. The herb is the scientist, science is the mountain, everlastingly out of the multitude, and the corpse is a man without knowledge. And once that man, this uneducated man, is educated through this system of knowledge, then he is revived. So the Panchatantra therefore becomes, as it were, the Amrita, right, which breathes life. So if you do not have Buddha or the exercise of Buddha, then you are as good as dead. The Panchatantra fashions, therefore, as it were, life into the lifeless. And this is what the Persian epic seeks to highlight. So look at the Indian knowledge system, an Indian narrative text embodying value systems traveling to another country, being adapted and recognized as being a source of knowledge. Now, many of you might argue that these stories had their own counterparts in these lands. So, folk tales are notoriously porous. But the recognition of the Panchatantra in different cultures and the proximity of the stories of the Panchatantra across so many literary cultures have alerted us to the fact in which knowledge systems operate through narratives, travel through narratives, and fashion selves through narratives. So one slide of conclusion then, what have we argued through this presentation? This is the last time I'll be bothering you. Well, maybe not. Tomorrow we'll have to do again. Right. So we've discussed questions about orality and authorship, how the Panchatantra is a compendium maybe of oral tales which are rescinded into a Sanskrit text. So we are also looking at how, indigenous languages, indigenous societies have their own stories, which travel and are adapted in a language that becomes the language of power and learning. And then that orality therefore becomes transmitted into narrative literature. We are looking at a text which has political and gender perspectives, which is simultaneously a ruler's manual as well as a children's literature. We have a text that travels with traders and from traders to different lands and becomes recognized as a source of knowledge and therefore indigenized there, and which percolates from narrative or storytelling into artistic perspectives as well. So from literature into sculpture as well, from secular to the religious, and again back to the secular. So, when you talk about literary cultures and narratives and Indian knowledge systems, I will repeat myself once again that apart from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which codify Indian value systems, the Panchatantra is a text that opens up, possibilities of knowledge systems through narrative, makes it accessible, and therefore argues for a Niti Shastra, which is based again on the Purusharthas, for arguing for a holistic, complete, prosperous life of a secular dharma. That is what I have been trying to arrive at. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'd welcome your responses. Thank you, Merelin, for helping me out with the power.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sir, for the comprehensive presentation you just made on the concept of Panchatantra. And I believe the audience would agree with me. And all this time, I grew up reading this text as merely as a children's text. But through this session, you have opened a new dimensions, a complete, a totally different dimensions. And in fact, as you mentioned rightly, as the compendium of the Indian knowledge systems. So now we will take queries if any audience would like to come in and interact or if they have questions. So the platform is open, dear participants. If you have any questions or queries, you can come in, and otherwise you can drop in the chat box. Let me check the chat box if any
Ma'am, may
questions.
I ask?
Yes, Miss Shukla. Yeah, please.
Yes. So, I want to ask that if I'm working on Raj Dharma and I want literary sources like Panchatantra, because and similar sources like Panchatantra, what other literary sources can you suggest where I can trace the politics, governance, and as you said, Niti or the Raj Dharma part of it?
Right. You can always go back to texts like the Hitopadesha, which again use these tales to talk about power. You can talk about, in terms of Indian literature, of course, you go back to texts like the Kathasarit Sagara, for example, again a compendium of stories. So the Panchatantra is not the only text that we can take a look at, where this question of Raj Dharma becomes very important. A very important text, and I'm sure you are looking at, is in that sense, the Jataka tales of Buddha, where again the question of Raj Dharma is discussed in some detail. So it is within these narrative texts. You have, of course, the dramatic texts again. But I would argue that if you talk in terms of katha within the Indian tradition, these would be the texts to go for when you are discussing or researching on Raj Dharma as it is depicted in narrative. Of course, the text that you, I'm sure, are looking at in greater detail is the Mahabharata, because the Mahabharata is again the ur text of Raj Dharma, right?
Yes,
The
sir.
Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they remain our major texts. But if you're looking at the Katha tradition, the Hitopadesha, the Kathasarit Sagar, and the Jataka tales would be good sources to go back for these ideas. But please remember that some of them, for example, the Kathasarit Sagar and the Panchatantra will argue for, for a more secular approach, while the Jataka tales would argue for a more ethical, religious approach. Right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ma'am, may I?
Do we have more? Yes, please go ahead.
Uh, Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, I would like to ask that whether ecological themes have been consciously dealt with in any of these, tales in the Indian context with respect to Indian knowledge systems.
No, that's an interesting question which I've been also grappling with. You know, in a way, you see, ecology as a separate phenomenon is not part of the Panchatantra. I think the primary reason for which is, this distinction between man and the animal world, the forest world, is not as clear as in the more modern, modernism, or we'll talk about industrialization or even modernity as the time when the human and the animal world actually sort of segregate, right? So, because the animal, the forest, and the human world are in such proximity, therefore, you see, the concept of ecology per se does not come in. But there are stray stories, for example, the areas where, for example, the elephants are raging in the forest, and the rabbits are being destroyed, right? So what does this rabbit do? It goes up to the elephant and talks about, the moon king as being the king of the jungles living in that lake, and how the elephant disturbs the moon king. So in that sense, the elephants then become afraid when the moon is disturbed, the shadow of the moon is disturbed. What is important to see here is that the balance of the ecology is retained in that text, right? Again, if you look at the major text of Mitra Labha, for example, you see, the hunter is a major character in the Panchatantra, and the hunter is always seen as somebody who is an alien within the forest area, as it were. So the trees and the animals are all scared of the hunter, and they team up to prevent the hunter from, gathering or scooping up each other. So in a sense, there is a sense, a very faint sense, but there is a sense of the human nature estrangement, alienation, and nature in some way reacting or coming into a form of alliance against man. Having said that, I will also say that, the hunter is shown also as a man who is marked by, need. He doesn't go there because he goes there because he has no other option left. He's seen as a very hungry, man who's just barely surviving. Incidentally, that story reminds me that the Panchatantra, I would say, is therefore not in that sense an ecological text. But remember something, that forest fires, for example, are never talked about. Cutting of forests is never talked about. So in that sense, the forest is there, right? And because of this proximity of man and the forest, I think the question of ecology does not rise so much. But that's a very, very valid question. Maybe if you rewrote the Panchatantra now, that question would come in. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Do we have more questions from the participant? We have time, still time.
Yes, I have. Hello, Amrita. Good evening. I
Good
already
evening. Good
typed my
evening.
Okay.
Right.
She seems to be familiar voice.
yes, I already typed my question, and Thank you for this enlightening lecture, Amrita. Like, it's always a pleasure to listen from you.
Thank
But
you.
I just want to know that what about the woman in the condition of travel? Because during that time it was very strict gender roles were there. So
No, there's no question about women traveling in the Panchatantra.
okay, and what
It
about
is
the
forbidden.
forbidden during that
Men
time?
are shown as traveling. Men go traveling for wealth. It is a very patriarchal world of the Panchatantra. In fact, one of the great inequalities of the Panchatantra is how the woman is persistently seen as a kind of an antithesis to social equilibrium. In fact, a very overwhelming majority of the stories which feature women are stories that about how women upset the social balance, how they bring their lovers back home, how they provoke people into destroying friendships. There are, however, 2 or 3 stories which talk about royal princesses. You see, educated women who apply their intelligence. For example, there is this woman who realizes that there is a snake inside the man's belly, in her husband's belly, and therefore she finds out a way in which to cure him. But these are almost always upper class women. The other group of women, in 5 stories out of maybe 200, is the virtuous wife who will sacrifice everything for the husband. So you either have the angel in the house, which is few and far between, or you have the promiscuous woman who causes great harm to society, or you have the foolish woman who is again adamant on pestering the husband. In fact, the nagging wife is a character, a recurrent character again. So, while the Panchatantra says that the woman is at the center of the family, it lays down a pretty patriarchal code for the woman, and the woman really does not travel.
Okay, thank you.
So we have one question from the chat box. I'll read it for you. So would you please explain the significance of the title Panchatantra in the context of the matter of poor judgment you mentioned in the Panchatantra?
Right. So the Tantra is, as I said, a principle. So the 5 principles of living, therefore, would be, in that sense, the creation of friends and alliances, the loss of friends, the creation of peace by defeating the enemy, the use of intelligence to live a fulfilling life, and through the intelligence to gather wealth and preserve decorum within the family. So using these tantras, you have the purusharthas fulfilled, but the basis of that is the human intelligence, right? So it is in this way that the Panchatantra justifies its title. The 5 tantras leading to the 3 purusharthas, leading to a holistic, happy, prosperous life.
Thank you, sir. Any more question from the participants? Anybody else? Someone has asked, sir, please repeat the 5
Principles.
principles.
So why don't you share the PowerPoint with her? I have no problems in sharing this with the participants. If
do I share it right
ideas.
now? Which one? Do I share it right now, sir? Or
Yeah, please share it. Please share it. No problem.
Yeah.
Once again, Mitra Bheda, Mitra Labha, you have Kakulukyam or alliances, you have Aparishikaranam, which is, action, and you have Labdha Prasannam, loss of gains. So you have intelligent action and you have loss of gains because of non-intelligent action. So again, intelligence, friendship, alliances, this is the true, way through which the Purusharthas can be realized.
So
thank
may
you
I?
so much.
Sir,
Sir,
yeah, thank you so much for this kind explanation. It was very elaborated lecture. The only thing that I feel is that when we say that it was a patriarchal setup and men were going out and women were home, don't we also see that women were more like managers, home managers?
Well,
So, sir, you said that it was, antithesis to the equilibrium of the society. At the same time, what do I feel? That one is earning and one is managing the money, because she was always consulted on in all the family matters, in the social gatherings. She had her say, rather. I mean, this is what I feel, but you please focus more
no,
on
you see,
that.
the point is, unfortunately, most of these tales do not talk about women as managing the home. In fact, the overwhelming majority of these texts are about the woman as actually promiscuous and therefore taking a lover, creating a ruckus, destroying friendships, and therefore to be, in certain ways beaten, punished. In fact, women very often end up being mutilated in the Panchatantra. So the woman as the homemaker and the home manager is not really something that the Panchatantra always talks about. There are tales of that sort, but as a text, it is, I would say, a little hostile to women in many ways.
But sir, at the same time, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit extending the talk, but at the same time, there are foolish men who are shown in Panchatantra. There are men who are not so very intellectual. They go out, but sometimes they get stranded just out of some foolish reason. And so, I mean, there are some women who are venomous. At the same time, there are men who are also shown in the same.
Look, I can only say this much, that at that point of time in the organization of society, the
Yes.
Panchatantra was being truthful. It was reflecting what Indian society was like.
Yes.
Right? That we can say. But if you talk about what Indian society was like in terms of women, I would say it was a very conservative and in certain ways, a society which was extremely violent towards women. After all, it was a society that later on burnt its women. So, well, the Panchatantra was reflecting this patriarchal bias. We are looking at it through a lens of modernity, right? When we talk about the Indian knowledge systems, we talk about what we can glean from it. Now, whether you would like to see the woman as a homemaker, or whether you would like to see the woman as venturing out into all aspects of life, these are questions of debate, right? Debatable questions. I guess it is to each his own.
Yeah, sir. Interpretation and misinterpretation go together. Yes.
Yes, somebody has talked
So we
about The
have-
Prince by Machiavelli. I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah.
But remember that The Prince is a particularly is a text which has a direct kind of a message. It is a monarch's manual. The Panchatantra is more than a monarch's manual. It talks about domestic life. It talks about trade. So in that sense, it is much more. The Prince only instructs. The Panchatantra delights and instructs through narrative storytelling. Right? So I appreciate your sort of you pointing out the Prince. I could say Sun Tzu, I could talk about Arthashastra, right? What the Panchatantra does is, transform it into storytelling.
thank you, sir.
Thank you.